Volunteer Activity, an online presentation of the FEC's Information Division. The Federal Election Campaign Act and FEC regulations limit the sources and amounts of contributions used to finance federal elections. Individuals, for example, may contribute no more than $2,600 per election to a candidate for federal office. The term contribution is defined very broadly to include anything of value given for the purpose of influencing a federal election. Generally, the provision of goods or services at less than the normal charge results in a contribution subject to the law's limitations and prohibitions. As an exception to that general rule, the law includes exemptions that permit individuals to provide volunteer services to federal candidates and party committees without making a contribution. These exemptions for volunteer activity will be the focus of this presentation. Some of the exemptions are broad, placing virtually no restrictions on the individual's activity, while others are more limited. To begin, let's talk about the unlimited volunteer activities. These activities include offering personal services to a committee, holding campaign-related gatherings at one's home, church, or community room, the costs associated with a volunteer's living expenses, and finally, internet activity. First, let's look at personal services. An individual may volunteer his or her personal services to a campaign without making a contribution, as long as the individual is not compensated by anyone else. For example, if an individual helps organize a voter drive or offers his or her particular skills to a campaign, neither of those activities will result in a contribution, as long as the individual is not compensated. If the individual is compensated for his or her services, the activity is no longer considered volunteer activity, and the payments, if made by someone other than the campaign itself, result in an in-kind contribution from that person, subject to the limits, prohibitions, and reporting requirements of the Act. Since volunteer services are not considered contributions, individuals barred from making contributions, such as foreign nationals, can volunteer for a campaign or political party. However, the individual may not serve in a decision-making capacity within the committee. For example, a foreign national is allowed to attend campaign strategy meetings and events, but may not be involved in the actual management of the committee. The next exemption relates to the use of an individual's home. An individual can use his or her home or the reception room of his or her apartment complex for activities benefiting a candidate or political party committee without making a contribution to the committee. Volunteers may use recreation rooms for campaign-related activities as long as the facility is regularly used for non-commercial purposes by members of the community without regard to political affiliation. Any nominal fee charged for the use of that room will not count as an in-kind contribution to the committee and is not reportable. There is a similar exemption for campaign-related activities held in a church or community room. Volunteers may use a church or community room for campaign-related activities as long as the facility is regularly used for non-commercial purposes by members of the community without regard to political affiliation. Here again, any nominal fee charged for the use of the room will not count as an in-kind contribution to the committee and is not reportable. What about volunteers' living expenses? An individual can spend an unlimited amount of money on personal living expenses while volunteering for a political committee because the expenses are not considered contributions to that committee. The last of the unlimited volunteer exemptions involves internet activity. Volunteers may engage in internet activity for the purpose of influencing federal elections without having the activity count as a contribution or expenditure. This exemption applies to those acting with or without the knowledge or consent of a campaign or political party committee. The exempt activities include, but are not limited to, sending or forwarding emails, posting comments to a blog, creating, maintaining, or hosting a website, paying a nominal fee for the use of the website, and providing a hyperlink to a website. These types of volunteer communications need not include a disclaimer identifying the source of the message. The Internet exemption does not apply to paid political advertisements. Internet communications placed on another's website for a fee may result in a contribution or expenditure under the Act. The messages would also be considered general public political advertising and are viewed as public communications under the law. As such, the Act's disclaimer requirements would also apply. An individual may engage in volunteer Internet activity at work as long as the individual complies with the employer's rules for personal use of computers and Internet access. This kind of activity can include anything from forwarding political emails to signing up to work at a candidate's fundraiser. However, the individual must complete the normal amount of work for which the individual is paid, and the activity must not increase the overhead or operating costs of the organization. In addition, the Internet activity cannot be coerced or conditioned upon being used for particular candidates. For further information on Internet activity, please consult our guides on Internet communications and activity and disclaimers. Some volunteer activities are only exempt to the extent they fall within certain limitations. These include the purchase of food, beverages, and invitations for a campaign-related event, vendor discounts given to political committees, an individual's volunteer-related travel expenses, the use of corporate or union facilities for campaign-related activity, and free legal and accounting services. First, let's look at the exemption for food, beverages, and invitations. When an individual hosts a campaign-related gathering in their home, community room, or church, the cost of the invitations and the food and beverages served at the event are not considered contributions if they remain under certain limits. If the event benefits a candidate, the limit is $1,000 per election. If the activity benefits a political party committee, the limit is $2,000 per year on behalf of all committees of the same political party. If a married couple hosts an event for a candidate in their home, they would each be allowed the $1,000 exemption and together would be able to spend up to $2,000 on invitations, food, and beverages without making a contribution. However, if the hosts go over the limits, the excess will count as an in-kind contribution to the committee, and it is reportable. The exemption is available only to residents. It would not apply to individuals co-hosting the activity in another individual's home. Any expenses paid by the non-resident co-host are considered to be contributions and must be reported. The next exemption allows certain vendors to offer discounts to campaigns and party committees. A vendor of food and beverages, whether incorporated or not, may offer a discount to a candidate's campaign or party committee. However, the amount charged must at least equal the vendor's costs of the items, and the amount of the discount cannot exceed $1,000 per candidate per election, or in the case of a party committee, $2,000 in a calendar year. Discounts that exceed these amounts would be considered contributions and would be prohibited if the vendor is incorporated. Next, let's take a look at individual travel. An individual may pay for his or her own travel expenses related to candidate or party activities. An individual may spend up to $1,000 per candidate per election, and up to $2,000 on behalf of all political committees of each political party in a calendar year for campaign-related travel. However, if the individual spends over those limits, the excess is reportable as an in-kind contribution and counts against the individual's contribution limit. In addition to the $1,000 and $2,000 travel expenses exemption, a campaign volunteer may spend unlimited amounts of personal funds for his or her meals and lodging without making a contribution, as long as the expenses incurred are incidental to volunteer activities. A committee is permitted to reimburse a volunteer's travel expenses and, as long as the reimbursement takes place within a certain time frame, no contribution will result. The following timeframes apply. If the travel expense is paid for by cash or personal check, the committee must reimburse the individual within 30 days of the expense being incurred. If the travel expense is paid for by credit card, the committee must reimburse the individual within 60 days of the closing date on the credit card billing statement where the charge first appears. Outside of these timeframes, the excess spent by the individual is counted as an in-kind contribution to the committee. Now let's examine the use of corporate and union facilities. In general, if an individual provides services to a campaign during paid working hours, the employer is making a contribution. However, if you are an employee or stockholder of a corporation, or an employee or member of a labor organization, you may make limited use of your organization's facilities for volunteer activity without making a contribution. For example, an employee could use an office phone to make calls pertaining to political volunteer work, but the activity must not interfere with the employee's work or the organization's normal activity. In order for the activity not to be counted as a contribution, the Commission suggests limiting the activity to incidental use of the corporate facilities. If the activity exceeds incidental use, or the individual uses the organization's equipment to produce campaign materials, the individual must reimburse the organization within a commercially reasonable amount of time. The reimbursement is considered a contribution from the individual to the political committee and must be reported. Incidental use is anything that does not prevent the employee from completing his or her normal amount of work and does not prevent the organization from carrying out its usual business. FEC regulations include a safe harbor for volunteer activity limited to no more than 1 hour per week or 4 hours per month. Finally, let's take a look at legal and accounting services. An entity may provide a political committee with free legal and accounting services as long as the services are provided for the sole purpose of helping in compliance with the Act and do not further the election of any federal candidate. The entity paying for the service is the regular employer of the individual providing the service, and the employer does not hire additional employees in place of the volunteer employee. The committee must report the value of the service as well as the name of each person who performed the service and the dates of service. The legal and accounting exemption does not permit an organization to donate equipment such as computer hardware or software for the committee itself to use for compliance purposes. The exemption applies only to the provision of those services. Bear in mind that an individual can personally volunteer his or her legal and accounting services without compensation under the volunteer service exemption and not be subject to the restrictions of the legal and accounting exemption. That concludes our overview of the volunteer activity exemptions. The aim of this presentation has been to equip individuals wishing to volunteer for a federal committee with all the information they would need to do so properly. The Federal Election Commission is committed to helping individuals comply with the federal campaign finance laws. We provide a wealth of compliance information on our website, maintain a toll-free information line you can call for help without having to identify yourself. We respond promptly to questions sent by email, and we conduct conferences throughout the country, host roundtable workshops in Washington, D.C., and visit state capitals to meet with local candidates, party, and PAC representatives. We encourage you to make use of these resources and look forward to serving you.